So whenever you're building a full stack project, you typically begin by starting with your backend first. You'll write up an API, connect to a database, and finally you'll begin to transition to the front end. Well, what if you can skip all of that and go straight to beginning the UI and still have a full stack application? Well, today we're going to build a simple node application using the latest version of Next.js, server actions, local file storage, and Tailwind CSS. In this project, we will not have any databases, no API routes, just a local file and a very simple minimal UI. So to get started, server actions are functions that run strictly on the server directly from a React component. And instead of calling an API route, you can just call a server function right inside of your form. This means that you don't have any client-side fetching, no extra endpoints, and no writing of the same logic more than once throughout the file. They simply work by adding the use server directive either at the top of a file or within the function. So with that said, I'm going to show you how simple it is to implement server actions in a full stack CRUD application. To get started, in the root directory, we'll add a folder named lib and inside of it a file named action.ts. We'll begin by adding the use server directive at the top of the file, indicating that this file is going to strictly be ran on the server. Then we want to set up a file-based backend using the fs module. This is going to let us read and write to a JSON file just like we would any other database. Here we're going to define a TypeScript type named note. Each note is going to have a unique ID, which will be a number, and a title that will be a string. Then we'll need to build the path to our notes.json file where we're going to store the notes on the server. The process.cw gets the current working directory of the project, which is the root folder. We're going to use path.join to add the path to a folder named data and a file named notes.json. Then we'll add a asynchronous function that will allow us to read all notes. It will read the data from our notes.json file and return an array of those notes. The return type is going to be promise note, which means that we're going to return a promise that resolves to any array of the notes object. We'll start with the try catch block because reading the file, it might fail, especially if the file doesn't exist just yet. The try block is going to let us handle any errors without an issue. We'll use fs.read file to read the contents of the file. It's going to take in two parameters, the file path, and we'll tell it to read UTF-8 as a string. Since this is asynchronous, we'll use await to await the file to be read. If the file reads successfully, we'll parse the JSON string into a JavaScript array using json.parse. This is going to give us a list of saved notes as a JavaScript object. And if there's an error, like the file doesn't exist, we'll catch it and return an empty array. That way the app doesn't crash and we'll be able to just start with no notes. Since we now have the ability to read any data within our database, next we want the ability to write. So we'll create an asynchronous function named write notes. It's going to it'll take one argument, an array of note objects, and write them to a notes.json file. We'll use fs.write to write the notes to the disk, and we'll pass in the file path, then use json.stringify to convert the array into a JSON string. We'll give the file name an indent with 2 spaces. That way it's easy to read. And then finally, we'll write it UTF-8 to text. So with the ability to read and write to the database, now we want to establish our CRUD server actions. The first one will give us the ability to add or create a note. So with this asynchronous function, it'll be defined or named as add note. And it's going to take in a form data object that's going to come from the form submission from our front end. The function is going to return nothing. So the return type is promise void. We'll extract the title from the form data and cast it as a string. That way we don't get any TypeScript errors. We'll call the read notes function to get the current list of notes from the file. We'll create a new note object and we'll use date.now to generate a unique ID and we'll pass in the title. Then we can add the new note to the beginning of the list and write an updated array to the file. Finally, we'll call revalidate path to tell Next.js to refresh the home page so the new note will appear immediately. Next, we'll create a function named delete note. We'll start by capturing the ID from the form data. Then we'll want to establish a connection. So we'll call the read notes function. We'll filter out the note with the matching ID. Then we'll write the updated list back to the file, and we'll use revalidate path to revalidate the data on the server. Then we'll have a function named get notes. That's basically just going to return the result of the read notes function, which is going to load all of the notes from that file. Next, we'll have a function named getNoteById. We'll start by loading all of the notes from the database. Then we'll find a note whose ID matches the one that is being passed into it, return that note or undefined if we're not able to find that note. Finally, we'll have a function named updateNote. In this function, we're going to extract both the ID and note title from the submitted form. We're going to read all of the current notes and map over those notes. And if a note matches the ID that was passed in, we're going to return that note with the updated title. Otherwise, we're going to return it as is. Then we're going to save the updated notes to the file. And finally, we'll redirect the user back to the home page. So with that, we've just established our local storage database and a action.ts file that's going to hold all of our CRUD server actions. Next, we're going to integrate these actions into our front end so that we have the ability to create, read, update, and delete any note. So now we're ready to add our server actions to our front end. We'll start by importing the 3 server action functions from the actions file. Get notes is going to get all of the notes from the database. Delete notes will delete notes, and add notes will give us the ability to add a note. We'll bring in link from next/link. This is going to help us with our client-side navigation. And then I'm adding the React FI icons just for style purposes, a edit and trash can icon. Feel free to use any icons, SVGs, or just plain text as you like. We'll then define some constants for all of our Tailwind CSS class names. This is just to keep things simple, clean, and reusable. We'll then create a asynchronous function named home. The get notes function, as mentioned previously, is going to load all of the notes from our file. Inside of the return statement, we'll start by adding in a div for the container and an H1 for the heading of the text. We'll then create a form that uses the add note server action. When the form is submitted, the add note will be called on the server. We have a input with the name title that's going to capture the title. We'll be using this button to trigger the server action whenever we click create note. We'll then add a div and gain access to all of the notes inside of our database. We'll add some conditional rendering in the event we don't have any notes in the database. We're going to show a message that we don't have any notes to display. Otherwise, we're going to map over the notes array. And for each note, we're going to create a card. That card will include a title. The title will also be a link that has a href to the note/ID page that we have not created just yet. This is what's going to allow us to get the note by its specific ID. And we're also going to have the ability to update that note from that page as well. We'll also include a edit button, which will provide the same functionality as the note title. This is just for an improved user experience. And then we'll include the delete note server action that'll be passed inside of a form that will give us the ability to delete a note. And notice that we're passing in the ID as a hidden input type. That way the user doesn't actually have to see the input, but we're just going to pass it into the form as a hidden type. Now let's go ahead and click save. And if we start up our application on our local host, we can do that by going into the terminal and typing in npm run dev. As you can see on our local host, we have our title of my notes, the input to capture the note title, and the button to create a note. Since we don't have any notes currently to display from our database, we're getting the message of no notes to display. So now let's test this out by adding our first note. So we'll say my first note. Click create note, and you notice that the note immediately appears within our note list without any page refreshes. That is because we're using revalidate path from next/cache. Let's test it out by adding a second note. Say my second note. Great. Now we notice that the note immediately appears within the list. So now let's test out the delete functionality just to make sure that that works properly. Once we've clicked delete, you notice that the note is no longer appearing within the list. No page refreshes took place. That is because of revalidate path as well. The last functionality that we want to test out is the ability to edit a note. And the path for it is /note ID. So let's go ahead and create that dynamic route now. So in the root directory inside of the app folder, let's add a file named open bracket ID close bracket. Inside of it, we'll add a file named page.tsx. Just to test this out to make sure that the route is working properly, I'm just going to create a export default function named edit page. And if we click on the edit button, we notice that the route goes to localhost /ID, which is the ID of this specific note. And you're noticing that it is reading edit page on screen. So that means it is working properly. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all of the content from this page component. So now we're ready to update this page so that we have the ability to edit or modify our notes. We'll begin by importing two server action functions, get note by ID, which will fetch the note by a specific ID, and update note, which will handle the form submission so that we can modify or update the note. Then we'll basically define the expected props for the component with the app router dynamic routes like ID enclosed in brackets can pass a value through params. We're going to expect the params.id to be a string. Then we'll add in the Tailwind CSS constants just for simplicity and to keep our return statement a lot cleaner. Now we're ready to define the edit page component. It's going to be an asynchronous server component that's going to receive the params object with the note ID. We're going to call the get note by ID function and pass in the params.id. If the note wasn't found, we want to make sure that we're showing a message back to the user. This is going to make sure we're not just re-rendering an edit form with undefined data. In the return statement, this is going to render the heading and a form to update the note. We'll use the HTML form element, which is going to pass in the update note server action. When we click submit, it's going to run on the server. Notice that we're passing in the ID as hidden. That way the user doesn't actually see this. The default value of our input is going to be the note title. The button will have the ability to submit this data to the server as its type is submit. So now if I click save, you'll notice that we have the title of this specific note and we have the ability to update it. So if I add some additional text to update the note, we'll click update. What should happen is we're going to be redirected back to the home page with this updated information. So let's test it out. And you see that we now have the updated text of update now. So with that, we've just created a full stack Next.js CRUD application using server actions, local storage, and TypeScript. We have the ability to create, read, update, and delete a note, all server rendered without any client-side activity. This is going to serve as a foundation of multiple videos where we're going to add in additional Next.js features and build on to this application and eventually connect it to a database. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel, give it a like, follow along the mini series. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.